They said the courtroom was supposed to be a place of justice, a sanctuary where truth stands taller than prejudice. But on that day, justice was nowhere to be found. In front of stunned witnesses, a decorated black Navy SEAL, someone who had risked his life for his country, was humiliated in the very place meant to protect him. A single act of violence shattered the silence, leaving everyone in shock. But what happened next was something no one saw coming. One call would flip the script, exposing truths far bigger than that courtroom. The question is, whose side was justice really on? Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow the story gets even bigger. Before that shocking day in court, he wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was a Navy SEAL, a man forged through discipline, sacrifice, and unshakable courage. Years of service had shaped him into someone who stood tall in the face of danger, someone who put his country above everything else. Yet when he came home, the battles didn't stop. They just looked different. He carried himself with quiet pride, often overlooked by strangers who never knew the price of his service. Friends described him as steady, humble, the kind of man who never asked for recognition. But beneath that calm surface was a truth he could never ignore. No matter how many medals he earned, his skin color spoke louder than his uniform in the eyes of some. When he entered the courtroom that morning, it wasn't as a soldier or a hero. It was as a black man standing in a system that has too often failed people who looked like him. He thought the fight that day would be about justice, about fairness. He had no idea it would turn into something far more humiliating, far more brutal than any battlefield he'd ever faced. The morning felt heavy from the start. As the Navy SEAL walked into the courthouse, every step echoed with a strange tension, as if the walls themselves knew what was about to unfold. He wasn't on trial for a crime. He was there to stand as a witness, to use his voice in pursuit of fairness. But from the moment he entered, the atmosphere shifted. The glances, the whispered words, the subtle shake of a head from the bailiff, it all sent a chilling reminder that even in uniform, even decorated with honors, he was still seen first as a black man. He sat down quietly, back straight, hands folded, the discipline of his training never leaving him. But the energy in that room pressed against him like a weight. When the officer at the center of the case entered, eyes darted. This wasn't just about testimony anymore. It was about power and who was allowed to hold it. As the proceedings unfolded, he felt the tension rise. Each time he prepared to speak, interruptions cut him off. Each word he tried to offer was met with dismissive glares. The system that should have leaned in to hear the truth seemed determined to silence him. He had been ignored before, overlooked before, but this was different. This was public, deliberate, humiliating. And then it happened. The officer, a man sworn to uphold the very laws this courtroom represented, suddenly broke every rule. In front of the judge, the jury, and a stunned audience, he lashed out. A swift, shocking movement, his boot driving into the decorated veteran, knocking him back in a way that left the entire room gasping. For a split second, silence blanketed the chamber. You could hear a pin drop, the collective disbelief hanging in the air. Here was a man who had survived war zones, who had carried brothers in arms through gunfire, and yet, in this place, surrounded by officials sworn to protect justice, he was reduced to a target of violence. Not on the battlefield, but in the very heart of a system meant to safeguard fairness. The SEAL steadied himself, his body aching but his pride unbroken, and in that silence, everyone waited to see what he would do. Would he retaliate? Would he shout, demand respect? But instead, he reached for something far more powerful. A simple action, one phone call, set events into motion that no one in that courtroom could have anticipated. Because what came after wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about that kick. It was about pulling back the curtain on something much larger, something that would force everyone in that room, and everyone watching this story unfold, to confront an uncomfortable truth about justice in America. And the question wasn't just what would happen next, it was who would stand on the right side of it. The room erupted the moment his body hit the ground. Gasps, shouts, the shuffle of feet as people rose from their seats in disbelief. The officer's boot had landed on more than just a man, it had landed on every principle the courtroom claimed to uphold. And yet, in that instant, the silence of authority was deafening. No gavel struck, no reprimand came. The judge looked down, stone-faced. The bailiff stood frozen, eyes darting, waiting for someone else to move first. For the Navy SEAL, time slowed. Pain surged through his body, but the sting of humiliation cut deeper than any bruise. He had survived ambushes, carried bleeding brothers through deserts and jungles, stared down enemies who saw him as less than human, but never, not once, had he expected to feel that same degradation inside the walls of American justice. Here he was not a soldier, not a hero, not even a citizen to be respected. He was just a black man, brought low by a system that looked the other way. And still he didn't break. He rose, steadying himself with a strength born of battles no one in that room could see. Every eye was on him now, waiting for the explosion, waiting for the rage, waiting for the outburst that would prove their prejudice right. But instead, he reached calmly into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and pressed a single number. The line clicked, a voice answered. And in that moment, everything shifted. The officer who had kicked him suddenly stiffened. The bailiffs exchanged nervous glances. The judge's expression faltered for the first time all day. They knew something the crowd did not. That call wasn't just a lifeline, it was a spark, one that would ignite consequences far beyond those courtroom walls. The kick had been meant to silence him. Instead, it had set in motion a chain of events no one could stop. And what followed would leave everyone asking, what happens when the system can no longer protect its own? The call changed everything. Within minutes, the quiet weight of authority shifted. Higher officials arrived, eyes scanning the room, no longer blind to the violence that had taken place. The officer who had thrown the kick was pulled aside, his arrogance replaced by a flicker of fear. And though the process would take time, hearings, investigations, endless paperwork, the balance of power had cracked. For once, the truth couldn't be buried under silence. But for the Navy SEAL, the bruise on his body wasn't the only mark left behind. The deeper wound was a reminder of how fragile dignity could be when prejudice wore a uniform. He had worn his nation's flag on his shoulder, fought in deserts and seas, bled for freedoms others took for granted. And still, in his own homeland, he was reduced to a target because of the color of his skin. That courtroom became more than a place of judgment. It became a mirror, reflecting the harsh reality too many already knew, that racism doesn't disappear with medals or uniforms or even service to one's country. It lives in silence, in indifference, in the moments when justice chooses not to speak. And yet his choice not to lash out, but to stand firm, sent a message louder than any shout could. It forced the system to reveal itself. It forced the question that lingers long after the headlines fade. If even a man who risked his life for freedom isn't safe from racism in a courtroom, what does that say about justice for the rest of us? The answer is not simple, but the responsibility is to speak, to share, to refuse silence, because silence is what allows injustice to breathe. So I'll leave you with this. When faced with racism, will you look away or will you stand?